In murder, justice can only be found in the Voices of True Crime podcast. Fridays at 3 p.m. on AM 880 KIXI in Seattle. Thursdays at 3:30 on Alternative Talk 1150 KKNW Seattle. Now, for your host, Joe Goldberg.
Well, today we're going to be talking about a book coming out on the 30th of July, and it's called The Lewiston Shootings, an All-American Tragedy, and we've got the writer of that book with us. So that's Robert Conlin. So thank you for being here, Robert.
Thank you for having me, guys. I appreciate it.
Now, so Robert, first of all, before we get into the scenario of what happened here in the book and all that, what made you write this book?
Well, I live here in the state, about an hour from where the shootings took place, and I actually bowled in that bowling alley where they took place. I have a background as a journalist, and I knew the story was going to be told, and I thought, well, if somebody's going to tell it, then maybe it should be me, who has a sense of place in the people. And so that was the main motivation, was being here and having it feel somewhat personal. It affected everybody in the state, even though it was confined to Lewiston.
Okay, so let's talk about this. So the premise of the book and what happened, what's the basic details of October 25th, 2023? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Robert Carr II, a 40-year-old truck driver from a small town right near Lewiston, Bowdoin, was in the midst of a psychotic break that lasted about a year or so, and he went from fairly normal to unrecognizable to just about everybody who knew him. And he set forth on that evening, convinced that virtually everybody, was calling him a pedophile, obsessed with that idea. It started out with just strangers, and then it morphed into his family, and then eventually his only son. And he got in his car, he equipped himself with a Ruger AR-10, and he had an AR-15 as well, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition, and tactical thermal scope, and he drove about 15 miles to Lewiston in the evening and went into the bowling alley where it was called Just in Time, where he had bowled before on a number of occasions. And he went in and he opened fire, and he shot and killed 8 innocent people. There were 18 children inside the bowling alley. Thankfully, none of them were killed. I'm sorry, a 14-year-old, so you guess we'd call him a child. But he killed 8 people there and wounded several more. And then he left the bowling alley, and he got in his car and he drove 4 miles to a sports bar called Schemengees, and he had also been there, and he had participated in cornhole tournaments. And he opened fire there and shot and killed 10 people and wounded several more. And so that was 18 people he killed in total. And then he got into his car and he drove a few miles away, about 10 miles, to a distant location. As it turns out, he had the whole thing planned out, and he parked his car at a boat launch, and then he proceeded to go to his final destination. And we can talk about that as we progress, because that's where he was found there a couple of days later.
So, and this happened where? Like in Lewiston, you said. So what can you tell us about that town?
Yeah, Lewiston is it's in central Maine. It's I think the 3rd largest city, which in proportion to anywhere else is really small, but it's 37,000 people. It's a real working class city, a real mill city back in the day. It's on the Androscoggin River and has gigantic old textile mills. And it's gone through some rough times, and the city is, rebounded somewhat, but it's also experiencing some real heavy crime and fentanyl abuse and related crime these days. But, so in terms of crime in Maine, it's one of the more crime-ridden places, but, in perspective, to somewhere else. But, nobody had expected a mass shooting of this kind in the state. That was one of the big takeaways was, everybody was surprised by the scope of it.
Well, I think even if it happens in a more populated place, or I still wouldn't expect a mass shooting to happen anywhere I've been, even though it happens. You know what I'm saying? It's still going to be a shock, even though there's quite a few of them.
Yeah. Well, just to put it in perspective, I mean, the state of Maine had 18 homicides, and I think, 18 homicides the year before. So they had 18 in one night.
Hey, Bob, you mentioned in your description how he broke down over the course of a year. Why? Why didn't people notice?
Well, they did notice. There was no shortage of anybody noticing. It was over the course of a year. He started out, his family obviously noticed first. that he was becoming angry and more aggressive, and he was drinking more. He wasn't much of a drinker before, but it, morphed into, he started saying that strangers were calling him a pedophile. He was out in public, say at Home Depot or in a restaurant, and he would say, "See, they're here, they're talking about me." And whoever was with him would say, "No, you're crazy. It's not happening. Nobody's saying anything about you." He had just got some new hearing aids that he got over the counter. He was having a hard time adjusting those, so oftentimes he would shut them off because he had progressive hearing loss. I think that led to the sense of isolation and paranoia, but ultimately, I think, they found out later that he had severe traumatic brain injury, and, we could talk about that and what the cause of that might have been, but he just got worse and worse, and the family was desperate to try to get him some help. He had an 18-year-old son and was divorced, but he was close to his family, his farming family from the small town, and they tried. They contacted the sheriff's office, and, he's really a concern to us. We're all concerned about him. He has a lot of firearms. He's starting to really talk about this all the time, become obsessed with this idea. And he's getting very angry, and we're concerned, and we'd like you to do something. And this first happened in May of 23. The local sheriff's office in Saginaw County responded, and there wasn't much they could do. To give credit to the sheriff's department then, that particular deputy went out of his way to be proactive, to try to find a way to. He talked to his Army Reserve unit, and he was a 20-year member of the Army Reserve, NCO. And so he was very proactive. He was very concerned, and he did what he could, but there wasn't a whole lot to do at that point because, it didn't rise to the level of a threat to somebody. And that would change over the course of the summer. So
in essence, you're saying that he was started having these mental problems, breakdowns, and nothing was being done by anybody. I mean, the family was trying to reach out.
Yeah.
Did they go to doctors or anybody like that, or was there a psychiatrist involved or a clinic?
Ultimately, in July, he went to so they had 2-week training for the Army Reserve. This particular unit was a training unit, so they trained cadets at West Point, and they did that every summer. Most of the time, he was involved with training on grenades, throwing a lot of grenades. That particular time last year, he was supposed to help train on machine guns, but they were aware of some of his deteriorating mental health. They still allowed him to go, the Army Reserve. But while he was there, he had a meltdown, and which resulted in them, they called the New York State Police to the barracks because it was a National Guard camp, and so New York State Police had jurisdiction. And then the Reserve officers' command directed him to a psychiatric hospital, where he spent 19 days. And so, by that point, by July, it was now a known fact that he was getting worse and worse. But I think the fact that he went to the hospital made some people think, okay, now he's on the right track and he's going to get better. But as it turns out, he had no intention of getting better. He was telling a friend of his that he was speaking to from the hospital that he was going to lie to them to get us, to tell them what they wanted to hear to get out, which ultimately he did. And they let him out. Nobody knows why, because they haven't explained it, but he had told them that he had a hit list. They knew about his paranoia, and they knew about his obsession with this pedophilia, and they knew about his firearms. They knew that the Army psychiatrist who first saw him suggested or strongly urged that he not have any access to weapons. And despite that, he was released in August and came right back to Maine. And the first thing he did, actually, when he came back, was to try to buy a suppressor. But he was denied the ability to do that because he had to check off he had to fill out the form. Believe it or not, suppressors can be harder to buy than guns. So he had to fill out a form, and he answered honestly when they asked whether he had been adjudicated in a mental facility. So he was denied the access to that suppressor. I don't know if he intended to use it or not. It seemed like at that point he was actively planning to do what he did. But, of course, nobody knew that at the time. But clearly he was deteriorating. At that point, there were so many opportunities to intervene. The Army Reserve is limited in terms of how much they could do because they only have jurisdiction over him when he's on active duty with the Army Reserve. So that's usually about 38 days a year. Otherwise, they can't force him into mental health treatment, and they cannot take away his personal weapons. But they could coordinate with local law enforcement, and they chose not to do that until the very end.
Well, you say that he was planning over time.
Yeah.
I am no expert planning is one thing. Jumping to shooting and killing 18 people and wounding 13 others seems to be a pretty big step. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe he had just deteriorated to the point where that was just the next thing to do. But was there something that made the jump, or was that what happened?
Well, it's impossible to say with any clarity, but I think, just based on the evidence, when the police showed up at the base in New York in July, and ultimately we saw the video, the video came from the New York State troopers, was, he told them, this is what's happening, everybody's calling me a pedophile, and then he said something really ominous that up until that point they had been very conciliatory with him, but then he said, these guys are, they know what I'm capable of, and they know what I can do. The troopers were alarmed by that. You could tell from their reaction, but it didn't rise to the level where they thought they had to take his weapons away. Keep in mind, this is another state, and they have different laws. And so there were three really jurisdictions. There was Maine, and there was the Army, and then there was New York. So, it made it complicated. It seemed at that point, and his best friend who knew him for 18 years and was the last person that he had any contact with, I spoke to him at length, and he told me that, in retrospect, he could tell that he was planning to do what he did. And operationally, he planned to go to the bowling alley, and then he planned to go to the sports bar, and then he planned to go ultimately to the site where they found his body, where he used to work, and he planned to shoot all of them too, which is not something the Maine State Police has admitted, and I'll tell you why a little bit later. But so he had a plan. It's clear that he parked his car in a place that he could access his next destination, and he wasn't found for another 46 hours. So sitting there waiting to execute his plan, it didn't happen, only because there was a lockdown and those employees didn't come to work, or he would have killed a lot more people.
Now that it's happened and then they find his body, what goes on? What do the police do, and what's the follow-up? Did they figure out what went on? Let's talk about the after effects.
Yeah, man, that's a tough one. Well, so the Maine State Police was the main agency in charge in the state of Maine. They handle all homicide investigations outside of Portland and Bangor, the two largest cities. Over the course of that manhunt, from the time they found his car until the time they found his body, was about 46 hours. There were some 800 law enforcement here in the state, in that region, just helicopters and patrol boats on the river, and SWAT teams and armored cars, and it was crazy. I mean, they were shut down, locked down all over the place. People were just in fear. It was not only was it the shooting that was traumatic, but it was he could have been on the run anywhere. I think at some point as it went on, people thought, well, he's disappeared into the woods. He's trained. He's an outdoorsman, and he's a trained armed army guy. So he's gonna be gone for a long time. But as it turns out, they found him a mile away from where he parked his car. And the thing that they do not discuss and have not discussed, and once again, to criticize the police is easy, and to play armchair quarterback, it was a huge investigation, something way bigger in scale than anything they'd ever done before. And so it was chaotic. But in the midst of all that chaos, his brother, Ryan Carr, Robert Carr's brother, who was a ranger, U.S. ranger who did 4 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, he told them about 6 hours later, after the shootings, when they interviewed him, he said, I think my brother is going to go to Maine Recycling, where he used to work, because he hates those people. And then his best friend told the law enforcement the same thing. I think that he's going to go to Maine Recycling and he's going to shoot them, because he can't stand them. He thinks that the origin story about him being a pedophile started there at that place while he quit it. And I'll give you a little background on that in a second. But they were told that in the chaos, they were following all kinds of leads. There were 800 or 1,000 tips on a dedicated tip line, and they were chasing all those, but they weren't chasing the ones that made the most sense, which was he parked his car here at the boat launch, and then there was a path that went through the woods along the river and came out right behind the facility where he used to work, where he had a lot of animosity towards people, and ultimately where they found his body in a trailer in the parking lot. So, he could have easily have killed more people, and it certainly would have cut down the amount of, the extent of the manhunt if they had followed the breadcrumbs, but they didn't do that.
So at this point, what happens around him, like his family, friends and stuff like that, how do they handle this? And do they start taking the blame or start getting accused?
Yeah, I mean, I think the families, I spoke to the ex-wife and his sister at length, and, they're devastated. I mean, they have a tremendous sense of guilt and, but I think ultimately at the end of the day, the fact is that there was a commission that was formed by the governor to look into it. It consists of some high-level, judicial and law enforcement here in the state, and the interim report determined that the sheriff's office, when they responded to there was a call in September, and this is kind of chilling, but in September, his best friend was with him, once again, the last person who really had any contact with him, and they went to a casino, and on the way back, Robert Card accused his best friend of participating in this campaign to belittle him, and he punched him in the face while they were driving. His friend got out of the vehicle, and then he immediately texted his superior in the Army unit, and he said, ultimately, he said, "I'm afraid that he's going to snap into a mass shooting." That was his exact words. That Army commanding officer then contacted the Saginaw County Sheriff, this was in September, middle of September, and asked them to do a welfare check. And the Saginaw Sheriff sent out a 25-year deputy to do the welfare check. He knocked on the door, and he was fully aware now at this point that, that he was in the middle of a psychosis, had been in a hospital, possessed a lot of firearms, was getting worse and worse. He heard him moving around in his trailer, so he backed off, which he couldn't go in. Maine law did not allow him to enter without a warrant. You could not get a warrant to do protective custody under Maine law. So he backed off and didn't want to force any issue, and he just said, "Okay, I'm going to regroup." And you can understand that. That's a very dangerous position to be in. He was by himself. Ultimately, he had backup, but then he chose to, instead of formulating another plan, he contacted the family, was assured by the brother that they would try to get the firearms away from Robert. And then he just basically left it at that. And he went on vacation the next day and closed the case. When he came back from vacation 10 days later, nobody had done any follow-up at all. Nobody checked to see if he still had his weapons. Nobody checked to see if he was worse. Nobody checked to see if there was any harm done to him or other people. He came back from vacation and then he lifted the bolo. So he erased the file 6 that was an alert to other police to watch out for him without checking to see if anything had resolved at all. And he essentially closed the case without anything happening. And I think that's the part that really has a lot of people upset here in the state, that he did that. And then, the sheriff's office has refused to accept any responsibility. In fact, that particular deputy then announced he was going to run for sheriff because I guess he thinks he's so well qualified to do that, which is pretty arrogant, but he did. And he is in November. He's running for sheriff. So, it's hard to understand how he could have just wiped his hands clean of that without doing something.
Well, that seems like a big moment in the red flag, red crumb path that leads to this. But if they could have gone back, was there that one thing that someone should have done to say, "We've got to stop this"? Could somebody lock him away, take away his guns? Was there one thing, or would it had to have been a series of several things to make this not happen?
They didn't have to go into his trailer to take him into protective custody. They could have waited until he came out. They could have gone to his workplace. They could have formulated a plan right then, because at that point they understood how, you can listen to some tapes where that particular deputy is telling people, "Oh yeah, he's definitely in a really bad way. He's got a lot of weapons, and he's just came out of a psychiatric hospital. He seems to be getting worse." And, so he was aware of that was the opportunity that really presented itself. But there are also opportunities for in his Army unit, there were multiple law enforcement officials, including a sheriff from the neighboring county, who personally witnessed his meltdown in New York. And so he knew how much of a danger he was. So not only was he an Army NCO, but he was a sheriff, of a county. So, to think that they wouldn't have been alerted enough to the dangers. They've all been well trained on how to recognize these things. And so there were opportunities for a long time, for months, I think, for somebody to do something, to formulate a plan between the Army and law enforcement, local law enforcement, multiple opportunities. And they just one after another, they were sort of just ignored, and the ticking time bomb just kept ticking. Ultimately, he exploded. It's as simple as that. I mean, his own friend was saying he's going to do a mass shooting. I'm afraid he's going to do a mass shooting. So, they had that.
Well, why do you think that people don't act on this sort of suspicion, or when they see something and they're trained, like you said, for instance, that one guy. So when they have experience and they kind of understand it better than, let's say, a common Joe citizen out there. So why don't they actually act? Why does nothing happen?
Man, I wish I knew. I mean, I don't know. I certainly play devil's advocate. I try to put myself in the shoes. I don't want to point fingers and say somebody just completely failed, but it's just hard to understand. I mean, this is your job. Public safety is your job. And this has happened in multiple mass shooting cases. It happened in Sutherland Springs when the Air Force didn't flag that guy multiple times. It happened in Buffalo when that kid was sending up red flags left and right on social media. It happened in Dillon Roof in South Carolina. He was letting everybody know what he was going to do. It's not like it's a rare occasion. There definitely seems to be, in this case, I certainly recognize it was a territorial, I can't tell this guy because he's in this county and they deal with it this way. So I remember one of the Army guys said, I knew I couldn't call Saginaw County and say, I suggest this, because they'd be like, well, piss off. This isn't your responsibility. This is our territory. So there seems to be some of that going on.
How do you approach a state which is in trauma and the families and friends and the people who have dealt with this? How do you deal with this highly emotional topic when you're trying to write a book about something which is really fresh?
Yeah, wow, that's a good question. That was the hardest part. I knew it going in. It would be the hardest part, and it definitely was the hardest part. Emotions are so raw. These are 18 people who just set out to have fun one night, and they didn't come home. A lot of kids were left behind. 4 of the victims were deaf, and they were participating in a deaf cornhole league. They were very close-knit, the deaf community. I talked to his wife through an interpreter interviewed her at a local library, and it just was, it was hard not to cry. It's 4 young kids. And so approaching it is, you just have to be human. You're a human being and they're a human being. And they suffered a horrible loss. And I'm not that guy that I'm not a daily news reporter that can call up and just hound somebody to death. I worked hard at trying to cultivate relationships with people. I live here. That was part of it, was just always recognizing that this is another human being who's really suffering right now, and respect that. And if they don't want to talk, they don't want to talk. It's so overwhelming when you're looking at the photos of 18 individuals, and when you delve into it. And I took 6 or 7 months to write the book, and I got a real sense of their life stories. I didn't talk to all the families, but just read as much as I could about them. And it was 18 individual murders. Yeah, it was pretty overwhelming. Here's the thing I haven't mentioned was that, and this is tragic, is that he was obsessed with being called a pedophile. And the reason why he went to Main Recycling, and I just know this from knowing enough about the kid and talking to his friend and just surmising what happened and his sister, was that he worked at Main Recycling where they found his body. And that was the first place that he mentioned that people were calling him a pedophile. And his friend who worked with him said, no, nobody's calling you a pedophile. But then I guess he overheard some reference to Robert Card being on the Maine sex offender registry. He didn't do anything about it, but Robert Card's sister did. She went on the Maine sex offender registry, and she wanted to look into this and find out whether her brother was on it, or why were people saying that he was on it. And she went on and she put his name into the search bar, but he's Robert Card II. And she must have typed in Robert Card II, and it didn't come up. As it turns out, there is a Robert Card on the sex offender registry in Maine. And that's not a common name, by the way. And not only that, but they share very similar birthdays, like 4483 and 4384, something very close to each other. And so I think what happened was the origin story started at Main Recycling. And so I asked myself, well, why would they be saying that at Main Recycling? And then I looked into the database on the registry, and at least 12 of those employees there were on the registry themselves. I think what happened was that he overheard them. He had new hearing aids, by the way, which were causing him a huge amount of difficulty, these new Bluetooth-enabled hearing aids. And he couldn't get the volume right, so he kept shutting them off, and then he would turn them up, and then he could overhear conversations like Superman from far distances. And that's actually was thrown into this toxic stew was he claimed that he could hear people, 500 yards away calling him. Ultimately, he went haywire with that story in his head. But I think it started there. And so there's no doubt in my mind that he went back there. And that really was his intent was to kill his coworkers. And the fact that there was a Robert card on the registry is just a tragic circumstance.
Well, that was sort of my next question, which is, did anything significant or anything at all come out of this as a positive? Were those laws, whether it be law, whether it be change of the system?
Yeah, I can tell you that, one positive, and the Card family is they find some solace in this fact because the family is an extraordinary family. I feel for them so much because they had not only grief about their brother, but just remorse and guilt and all that stuff. And so they're remarkable people. The sister, so they're working actively now to try to help deal with the mental health issues with veterans. And there's no doubt his brain was studied by Boston University's Traumatic Brain Injury Unit, nationally recognized leader in the field of studying this, and they found significant traumatic brain injury. So most assuredly associated with his training in the Army throwing grenades. So as a result, there's been some changes. There was a bipartisan bill that was passed. It was called the National Blast Overpressure Act, which is mandating that all the armed forces, new recruits now in all the 4 armed forces have to be tested cognitively when they come in, and then tracked during their stay and afterwards, so that they can have a baseline assessment for, do they have any traumatic brain injury? Is this training that they're doing causing this? And it looks like there's a definite correlation, and so that's a positive. And the family's really, really, happy that, well, obviously not happy, but at least they know that their son and brother didn't just walk in and cold-bloodedly murder people for no reason.
Do you do social media yourself, or do you any promotions or a website, or let's talk about where people find you and the book?
I do have a Facebook page, my name. The book is July 30th. It's available, of course, on Amazon or anywhere. Wild Blue Press, and...
Oh, of course, yeah, and we'll put all that up on the website so people can find it, and we appreciate you being here. Now, the book, of course, we're talking about is The Lewiston Shootings, and it's an all-American tragedy. Robert Conlin, thank you for being here.
Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you.
This has been a production of the House of Mystery Radio Show. To find out more about our show, guests, or hosts, go to our website at houseofmysteryradio.com.